Kayla Bennett, a shy 12-year-old, walked into Stanton Memorial Hospital, clutching a crumpled piece of paper with her mother's name on it. Her mother, Dr. Alicia Bennett, was the hospital's director, but Kayla wasn't there for a casual visit. She was desperate to find her. After a missed school play and unanswered calls, Kayla feared something was wrong. But instead of receiving help, Kayla was dismissed and judged by the hospital staff. A receptionist's cold assumptions and a call for security turned her simple request into a humiliating ordeal. The staff didn't know Kayla's mother wasn't just a doctor, she was the woman in charge. What follows is an emotional journey of discovery and change as Kayla learns to speak up for herself in the face of prejudice. Along the way, small acts of kindness from unexpected places fuel her determination. Together, Kayla and Alicia spark a ripple effect of transformation, proving that standing up for what's right can inspire change far beyond what they imagined. Kayla Bennett pulled her hood tighter around her head as the wind picked up, rustling the worn piece of paper in her hand. The name Dr. Alicia Bennett stood out in bold black ink, though the edges of the note were crumpled from being folded too many times. Kayla had written it herself after the receptionist at her school called to say her emergency contact wasn't answering. Kayla's mother always answered. At least, she used to. The faint glow of Stanton Memorial Hospital loomed ahead, its sliding doors welcoming a steady flow of people. Kayla hesitated just outside the entrance, her sneakers scuffing against the concrete. It wasn't her first time here, but she always came with her mother. Alone, the building seemed massive, cold, and uninviting. She clutched her backpack tighter, a pit forming in her stomach. Kayla lived with her mother in a small apartment on the west side of town. Her room was painted a cheerful yellow, a color she and her mother had picked out together after Alicia's promotion to hospital director. It had felt like a fresh start then, a chance to rebuild after years of struggling. Alicia worked long hours, but she always tried to make time for Kayla. Pizza nights, Saturday morning pancakes, and bedtime stories had been their routine until they weren't. As Alicia's responsibilities grew, her time at home shrank. Kayla understood, or at least she told herself she did. Her mother's work saved lives, but lately, the silence in their apartment felt heavier. Kayla had spent the past week practicing her lines for the school play, glancing at her phone every few minutes, hoping for a text from her mother. When Alicia didn't show up for the performance, Kayla didn't feel just disappointed. She felt invisible. The hospital lobby buzzed with activity. Nurses hurried past with clipboards, visitors paced nervously, and the faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. Kayla stepped inside, the automatic doors hissing shut behind her. She looked around, unsure where to go, until she spotted the reception desk at the far end of the room. The receptionist, a woman with sharp features and a crisp uniform, glanced up briefly as Kayla approached. Her name tag read, Mrs. Harper, but her expression suggested she wasn't interested in introductions. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Harper asked. Her tone clipped. Kayla swallowed hard. "I'm looking for my mom. She works here. Her name is Dr. Alicia Bennett." Mrs. Harper arched an eyebrow, glancing at the worn paper in Kayla's hand. "Your mother?" she repeated, skepticism dripping from her voice. Kayla nodded. "Yes, I need to see her. It's important." The receptionist's gaze shifted over Kayla's hoodie and scuffed shoes. "I'm sorry, but you can't just walk in here and demand to see someone. Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need an appointment," Kayla said, her voice trembling. "She's my mom." Mrs. Harper sighed, clearly uninterested in entertaining Kayla's plea. "Have a seat over there," she said, pointing to a row of plastic chairs near the wall. "I'll see what I can do." Kayla sat down, her legs swinging nervously as she watched Mrs. Harper return to her computer, typing away as if Kayla no longer existed. Minutes dragged by, each one amplifying the knot in Kayla's chest. She felt small, out of place among the adults who rushed by without a second glance. An older woman with kind eyes passed by and paused. She handed Kayla a tissue, noticing the tears welling up in her eyes. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" the woman asked softly. Kayla managed a nod. "I'm just waiting for my mom." The woman smiled gently. "I hope you find her soon." With that, she disappeared into the crowd. For a brief moment, the gesture warmed Kayla, but the receptionist's dismissive tone still echoed in her ears. She glanced at the clock on the wall. She didn't know how much longer she could wait. Unable to sit still any longer, Kayla approached the desk again. Mrs. Harper didn't bother to look up this time. "Excuse me," Kayla said, her voice firmer than before. "Did you find her yet?" Mrs. Harper sighed dramatically, turning to face her. "Young lady, I told you to sit down. We're very busy here. If your mother worked here, you would know how to reach her." "I do know," Kayla insisted, her frustration bubbling over. "She's the hospital director." Mrs. Harper blinked, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "The director. Right," she said, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Listen, sweetie, I don't have time for games." Kayla's chest tightened as she fought the urge to cry. "I'm not lying." But Mrs. Harper wasn't listening. She picked up the phone and murmured something too low for Kayla to hear. Moments later, a uniformed security guard appeared, his expression stern. "This young lady claims she's here to see the director," Mrs. Harper said, with a shrug. "But I think she's just causing trouble." The security guard, a tall man named Officer Lewis, crouched slightly to meet Kayla's eyes. "Is there someone we can call for you, kid?" Kayla shook her head, panic rising in her throat. "You don't understand. My mom really does work here." Officer Lewis frowned. "Okay, what's her name?" "Dr. Alicia Bennett." The name seemed to give him pause, but Mrs. Harper scoffed. "Do you know how many people come through here claiming to know someone important? We can't just let everyone waltz in." Kayla's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not everyone," she said, her voice shaking. "She's my mom." The guard exchanged a look with Mrs. Harper, his expression softening slightly. "Okay, let's see if we can figure this out." Across the lobby, a doctor named Dr. Emily Carter glanced up from her clipboard. She'd been observing the scene from a distance, unsure whether to intervene. Kayla's words tugged at her, but she hesitated. Hospital protocol was strict, and she didn't want to overstep. Still, something about the girl's desperation felt genuine. Dr. Carter took a tentative step forward, but before she could say anything, the sound of clicking heels echoed through the lobby. Heads turned as a tall, composed woman in a tailored blazer approached. Her sharp gaze swept the room, landing on Kayla. "Kayla!" the woman called, her voice clear and commanding. Kayla's head shot up. "Mom!" Dr. Alicia Bennett strode forward, her expression a mix of relief and concern. She knelt to embrace Kayla, holding her tightly for a moment before straightening to face the others. "What is going on here?" Alicia demanded, her tone icy. She directed the question at Mrs. Harper, who suddenly seemed much less confident. "This young lady was being disruptive," Mrs. Harper began, but Alicia cut her off with a raised hand. "She is my daughter," Alicia said firmly, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "And I would like an explanation for why she was treated this way." Alicia Bennett's voice, calm yet commanding, seemed to silence the entire lobby. For a moment, everyone froze. The receptionist, Mrs. Harper, stammered, searching for words that didn't come easily. "Dr. Bennett," Mrs. Harper began, her tone suddenly deferential. I didn't know she was your daughter." "That much is obvious," Alicia replied coolly, her eyes narrowing. "My daughter came here to find me, and instead of helping her, you chose to dismiss her. Explain yourself." Kayla tightened her grip on Alicia's hand. She felt a strange mix of relief and dread. She was finally safe by her mother's side, but the weight of the confrontation made her feel small again. Mrs. Harper fumbled for an excuse. I didn't mean any harm. We're just very busy, and I didn't realize—" "Didn't realize what?" Alicia interrupted. Her voice was even, but there was steel beneath it. That a scared child might need help? That she deserved a shred of compassion regardless of who her mother is? The security guard, Officer Lewis, stepped forward, his face slightly flushed. "Dr. Bennett, I think this was just a misunderstanding. The receptionist called us because she thought that my daughter was what? A problem?" Alicia's gaze shifted to him, pinning him in place. "You could have asked more questions before assuming the worst." Kayla shrank back slightly, embarrassed by the attention. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, it's okay," she whispered. "Can we just go?" Alicia softened as she looked down at her daughter. Her hand came to rest on Kayla's shoulder. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. We're leaving in just a minute." But the determination in her voice told Kayla that her mother wasn't finished. From across the lobby, Dr. Emily Carter lingered, watching the scene unfold. She had heard of Alicia Bennett, the new hospital director, was known for her no-nonsense leadership and sharp intellect. But seeing her now, standing tall and defending her daughter, Dr. Carter felt a pang of guilt for not stepping in sooner. She debated approaching them, her mind racing. "Why didn't I say something?" she wondered. But before she could decide, Alicia turned her attention back to the receptionist. "This situation never should have escalated to this point," Alicia said firmly. "Not for my daughter, not for anyone. Do you understand?" Mrs. Harper nodded stiffly, her earlier smugness replaced by unease. "Yes, Dr. Bennett, it won't happen again." "Good," Alicia replied, "because I expect better from this hospital, from all of us." Alicia guided Kayla toward the hallway leading to her office. The tension in the lobby eased as the two disappeared from view, though whispers followed in their wake. Dr. Carter, still rooted in place, finally exhaled. She promised herself she would speak with Alicia later. In Alicia's office, the sterile fluorescent lighting cast a harsh glow over the room. Kayla sank into the chair opposite her mother's desk, clutching her backpack like a shield. Alicia crouched in front of her, her expression softening. "Kayla, are you okay?" Alicia asked gently. Kayla nodded, but her eyes brimmed with unshed tears. I didn't know if you were okay. You didn't come to the play, and I thought maybe something happened." Alicia's heart sank. She had completely forgotten about the play. The weight of her responsibilities at the hospital had consumed her, leaving little room for anything else. "Oh, baby," Alicia said, pulling Kayla into a hug. "I'm so sorry. I should have been there. That's on me." Kayla sniffled, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. "I just wanted to find you." As Alicia held her daughter, guilt gnawed at her. She had worked so hard to provide a better life for Kayla, to ensure she had opportunities Alicia could only dream of growing up. But in doing so, had she neglected the one thing that mattered most? Alicia pulled back, brushing a strand of hair from Kayla's face. "You did the right thing coming here. I'm proud of you for being brave. But next time, promise me you'll call first. We'll figure it out together." Kayla nodded. "I did call. You didn't answer." The words hit Alicia like a blow. She had no excuse, only the grim reality of her overburdened schedule. "You're right," she admitted. "I need to do better, and I will." After settling Kayla with a cup of hot chocolate from the office kitchenette, Alicia returned to her desk. She opened her laptop, pulling up the hospital's visitor policies. As she skimmed through the document, her frustration grew. The language was cold and bureaucratic, focused more on restricting access than welcoming those in need. "This has to change," Alicia muttered to herself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Carter stepped inside hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her. "Dr. Bennett, do you have a moment?" Alicia gestured for her to sit. "Of course, and please, call me Alicia." Dr. Carter glanced at Kayla, who was curled up in a chair, sipping her hot chocolate. "I just wanted to apologize," she said. "I saw what happened in the lobby. I should have spoken up." Alicia studied her for a moment before nodding. Thank you for saying that. It's not easy to admit when we fall short. Dr. Carter hesitated. If there's anything I can do to help training sessions, policy reviews, I'd like to be involved. Alicia's expression softened. I appreciate that, Emily. We'll need all the help we can get. As Dr. Carter left, Alicia felt a spark of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Systemic change never was. But knowing she had allies within the hospital made the task feel less daunting. Kayla looked up from her chair, her eyes curious. Who was that? Just someone who wants to help, Alicia said with a small smile. She sat down beside Kayla, taking her hand. And you helped too, you know? What happened today wasn't okay, but it showed us what needs to change. Kayla tilted her head, considering her mother's words. Does that mean no one else will have to wait like me? That's the goal, Alicia said, to make this a place where everyone belongs. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with a drizzle tapping softly against the apartment windows. Kayla sat at the small kitchen table, nibbling on a piece of toast. Across from her, Alicia was on her laptop, typing furiously. Despite the lingering tension from the previous night, Alicia had insisted on keeping Kayla home from school for the morning. Let's spend some time together, Alicia had said. We'll talk. Just us. Kayla wasn't sure if just us meant sitting in silence while her mother worked, but she didn't complain. She was just happy to be near her. As Alicia typed, Kayla watched her with a mixture of admiration and longing. Her mother's sharp features were set in determination, her sleek ponytail swinging as she leaned over her laptop. Alicia had always been her hero, the woman who could do anything, but last night had changed something. For the first time, Kayla had seen her mother look vulnerable. What are you working on? Kayla asked softly. Alicia glanced up, her fingers pausing mid-stroke. I'm drafting a new visitor policy for the hospital. After what happened yesterday, it's clear we need better procedures. Kayla tilted her head. You're going to fix it? That's the plan, Alicia replied, offering a small smile. No one should feel like they don't belong, especially in a place meant to help people. Kayla nodded slowly, her mind replaying the events in the hospital lobby. Do you think Mrs. Harper was always like that? Alicia frowned, considering the question. I don't know, but sometimes people act out of habit or ignorance. It doesn't make it right, but it means we have a chance to help them do better. As Alicia spoke, her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the notification. It's from Dr. Carter, she said, mostly to herself. Kayla perked up. The lady from last night? Yes? She wants to meet and talk more about the changes we discussed. She also mentioned something about Mrs. Harper. Alicia's voice trailed off as she typed a quick response. What about her? Kayla asked, curiosity lighting her eyes. Alicia hesitated. Dr. Carter thinks Mrs. Harper might need training or a second chance. Kayla frowned. But she was so mean. She was, Alicia admitted. But part of my job is making sure we don't just punish people for mistakes. We need to help them learn from them too. Kayla thought about that as she finished her toast. Could someone like Mrs. Harper really change? And if so, would it even matter after what she'd done? By mid-morning, Alicia and Kayla were back at Stanton Memorial. The hospital seemed less intimidating this time, though Kayla still felt a flicker of unease as they walked through the lobby. Mrs. Harper wasn't at the desk, replaced by a younger receptionist who smiled warmly at them. Dr. Carter met them by the elevators, her expression a mix of professionalism and humility. Thank you for coming, she said, shaking Alicia's hand. Then she turned to Kayla, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. And thank you for being so brave yesterday. Kayla blinked, unsure how to respond. I just wanted to find my mom. And you did, Dr. Carter said, her tone gentle. But what you also did was show us how we can do better. I think that's pretty amazing. Kayla smiled shyly, warmth blooming in her chest. Dr. Carter led them to a small conference room where Mrs. Harper sat waiting. She looked different today, smaller somehow, her usual air of confidence replaced by nervous energy. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Bennett," Mrs. Harper began, her voice tight. I owe you both an apology. I acted poorly yesterday, and I'm sorry." Alicia nodded, her expression neutral. "I appreciate you saying that, but I'm not just here for an apology. I want to understand why it happened." Mrs. Harper shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean to be rude," she said slowly. "But when you work the front desk, you see a lot of people trying to take advantage. I thought—" her voice faltered. "I thought she was just another one of them." Kayla stiffened in her chair, but Alicia placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "And what made you think that about my daughter?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, her eyes darting to Kayla before returning to Alicia. I don't know. Maybe I jumped to conclusions. I wasn't thinking clearly." Dr. Carter spoke up, her voice measured. "Mrs. Harper, no one's perfect, but part of our responsibility as hospital staff is to treat every person who walks through those doors with respect. Yesterday, you didn't do that." "I know," Mrs. Harper said, her shoulders slumping. "I feel awful about it. I want to do better." Alicia studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I'm willing to give you that chance, but it won't come without effort. We're implementing new training protocols for all staff, and I'll expect you to be an active participant." Mrs. Harper looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett. I promise I'll do whatever it takes." As the meeting ended, Kayla lingered near the door, watching Mrs. Harper gather her things. On impulse, she approached the older woman, her small voice cutting through the quiet. "I hope you do better too," Kayla said, her tone sincere, "because other kids might need help, like I did." Mrs. Harper paused, her eyes softening. "I'll remember that," she said. "Thank you, Kayla." For the first time, Kayla saw something in Mrs. Harper's face that looked a lot like regret. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. On the way home, Alicia glanced at Kayla in the rearview mirror. "That was kind of you, what you said to Mrs. Harper." Kayla shrugged. "I just hope she meant it." "I think she did," Alicia said. "But even if she didn't, you reminded her what really matters. That takes courage." Kayla didn't respond, but a small smile tugged at her lips. For the first time since the school play, she felt a little closer to her mother. Maybe things weren't perfect yet, but they were moving in the right direction. The hum of the car engine was the only sound as Alicia and Kayla drove home, their minds busy with unspoken thoughts. Kayla stared out the window, watching the city blur past, while Alicia gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. The day's events replayed in her mind, Mrs. Harper's faltering apology, the guarded hope in Dr. Carter's voice, and, most of all, Kayla's quiet strength. As they pulled into the parking lot of their apartment building, Alicia turned off the engine and turned to Kayla. "Sweetheart, can we talk for a minute?" Alicia asked. Kayla hesitated, but nodded. She shifted in her seat to face her mother, the dim light of the dashboard softening her features. "I know the last few weeks haven't been easy," Alicia began. "I've been so caught up in work that I've let some important things slip, like your play. And I'm really sorry for that." Kayla looked down at her hands. "You didn't mean to forget," she said quietly. "You're just really busy." "That's not an excuse," Alicia said firmly. "You're my daughter, Kayla. You're the most important person in my life, and I need to do better at showing you that." Kayla's lips twitched into a small smile. "You're doing better now." Later that evening, after dinner and a game of cards, Kayla went to bed feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Alicia lingered in the kitchen, sipping a cup of tea and scrolling through her laptop. The hospital's visitor policy draft was open on the screen, but it still didn't feel right. The language was bureaucratic, too focused on logistics and liability. What it lacked was humanity, the very thing Kayla had reminded her was most important. Alicia closed her laptop with a sigh. She couldn't stop thinking about the way Kayla had spoken to Mrs. Harper earlier. It had been simple, but powerful. Kayla's words had cut through the noise, reminding everyone what truly mattered: kindness, empathy, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. Alicia pulled out a notebook and began jotting down ideas. She listed every moment in the hospital lobby that had felt wrong, then wrote next to it what could have been done differently. As the list grew, a vision for a new kind of hospital culture began to take shape in her mind. The next morning, Alicia arrived at the hospital early. The familiar buzz of Stanton Memorial greeted her. But today it felt different. She wasn't just here to manage crises or sign off on budgets. She was here to make a change. In her office, Alicia began organizing a meeting with key staff members, including Dr. Carter and the hospital's Human Resources Director, Ms. Linda Clark. She sent emails outlining her plans: a complete overhaul of visitor policies, mandatory empathy training for all staff, and a new protocol for handling complaints. By the time Dr. Carter knocked on her door, Alicia's desk was covered in notes and printed documents. "You've been busy," Dr. Carter remarked, raising an eyebrow. "Busy and inspired," Alicia replied, motioning for her to sit. "I've been thinking about yesterday, about Kayla." Dr. Carter nodded, her expression thoughtful. "She's a remarkable kid." "She is," Alicia agreed. "And she reminded me of something I'd started to lose sight of. Hospitals aren't just placing for treatment. They're places for people, and if we forget that, we fail them." As the morning progressed, Alicia and Dr. Carter worked side by side, drafting new guidelines and brainstorming ideas for staff workshops. Dr. Carter suggested inviting outside experts to lead some of the training sessions, ensuring staff heard diverse perspectives. "We should also include a way for staff to anonymously share their experiences," Dr. Carter added. "Sometimes the people closest to the problem have the best insights." Alicia jotted it down. "Good idea. And I want to make sure this isn't just a one-time fix. We need ongoing evaluations to keep us accountable." By the time the meeting with Ms. Clark began, Alicia felt cautiously optimistic. She presented their ideas with clarity and conviction, emphasizing the need for systemic change. Ms. Clark listened carefully, occasionally nodding. "It's ambitious," she said finally, "but necessary. I'll start drafting a proposal for the board." Meanwhile, in the lobby, Kayla waited for her mother to finish her meetings. She sat in the same row of plastic chairs she'd been in 2 days ago, but this time she felt less nervous. She had brought a book with her, a tattered paperback her mother had given her years ago, and was absorbed in its pages when someone approached. "Kayla, right?" She looked up to see Lydia, the young receptionist who had replaced Mrs. Harper during her break. Lydia held a steaming cup of hot chocolate and a small plate of cookies. "I thought you might like a snack while you wait." Kayla blinked in surprise. "Really? For me?" Lydia smiled. "Of course. I saw you sitting here and figured you could use something warm." As Kayla accepted the treats, a sense of warmth spread through her, not just from the hot chocolate, but from Lydia's kindness. "Thank you," Kayla said, her voice soft. "It's no problem," Lydia replied. "And for what it's worth, I think it's great that you stood up for yourself the other day. You reminded a lot of us that we can do better." Kayla's cheeks flushed. "I just wanted to find my mom." "And you did," Lydia said, "but you also made a difference." When Alicia returned to the lobby, she found Kayla chatting animatedly with Lydia. The sight made her pause, her heart swelling with pride. Her daughter, who had been so timid and unsure just days ago, was starting to shine again. As they walked to the car, Kayla told Alicia about Lydia's kindness. "She said I made a difference," Kayla said, her eyes bright. "Do you think that's true?" "I know it is," Alicia replied, smiling. "Because you reminded everyone what really matters." The morning after their meeting-filled day at Stanton Memorial, Alicia woke to the sound of Kayla humming softly in the kitchen. She followed the sound and found her daughter carefully arranging toast and scrambled eggs on 2 plates. "Good morning, Mom," Kayla said with a bright smile. "Breakfast is ready." Alicia's heart swelled. The simple gesture meant more than words. "Thank you, sweetheart. This looks amazing." As they sat down to eat, Alicia noticed a newfound lightness in Kayla's demeanor. The weight of the hospital incident seemed to have lifted, replaced by quiet confidence. It reminded Alicia why her work at the hospital mattered not just for Kayla, but for everyone who needed to feel seen, heard, and respected. Later that day, Alicia returned to the hospital with a sharper sense of purpose. Her first meeting was with Ms. Clark, who had been reviewing Alicia's proposal for policy changes. The older woman looked up from her desk as Alicia entered, her expression neutral but thoughtful. "I've gone through your plans," Ms. Clark began. "You're asking for a lot retraining, a dedicated oversight committee, visitor-friendly policies. It's going to require significant time and resources." "I understand that," Alicia replied firmly. "But it's necessary. What happened to Kayla wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger culture problem. We can't afford to ignore it." Ms. Clark leaned back in her chair, studying Alicia. "And you're prepared to take the heat if the board pushes back?" Alicia nodded. "Absolutely. This is too important to let bureaucracy get in the way." Ms. Clark scheduled a meeting with Stanton Memorial's department heads for the following day. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as staff filed in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Alicia stood at the front, her hands resting confidently on the table. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know you're busy, so I'll get straight to the point. Recent events have highlighted a significant issue in how we handle visitors and treat each other as staff. Today, I want to present a plan for addressing these issues head-on." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, which outlined the gaps in the hospital's current policies. As she spoke, Alicia noticed the reactions in the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others frowned or crossed their arms. One of the heads, Dr. Miller, interrupted. "Dr. Bennett, I understand your concerns, but do you really think retraining all staff is necessary? These situations are rare." "Rare or not, they shouldn't happen at all," Alicia countered. Her tone was measured but firm. "Every patient, visitor, and staff member deserve respect and dignity. And as leaders, it's our responsibility to ensure that's not just an ideal, but a reality." Dr. Carter chimed in. "I was there when the incident happened. It was a wake-up call for all of us. This isn't just about one mistake, it's about creating a culture of empathy." Her support seemed to sway the room. By the end of the meeting, most of the department heads had expressed their agreement, though a few remained reluctant. While Alicia was busy at the hospital, Kayla was at school, thinking about everything that had happened. During lunch, her English teacher, Ms. Taylor, sat beside her in the cafeteria. "I heard about what happened at the hospital," Ms. Taylor said gently. "That must have been scary," Kayla nodded. "It was, but it got better." Ms. Taylor smiled. "You're brave, Kayla. Not everyone could stand up like you did. Have you thought about writing about it?" Kayla blinked. "Writing about it?" "For the storytelling competition," Ms. Taylor explained. "It's coming up in a few weeks. Sharing your experience could inspire a lot of people." Kayla hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to talk about everything, let alone in front of an audience. But the idea stuck with her. Back at the hospital, Alicia stopped by the reception desk to check on Mrs. Harper. To her surprise, the older woman was diligently reading through a training manual, her expression focused. When she noticed Alicia, she stood quickly. "Dr. Bennett," Mrs. Harper began, her tone unsure. "I just wanted to say thank you for giving me another chance. I know I let you and Kayla down." Alicia studied her, noting the sincerity in her voice. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow, Mrs. Harper. I hope you'll make the most of it." "I will," Mrs. Harper promised. "And I'd like to help, if I can. Maybe with the training sessions. I've been thinking about how I could share what I've learned." Alicia nodded slowly, considering the offer. That's a good idea. I'll talk to Ms. Clark about including you. As she walked away, Alicia felt a small flicker of pride. Change was never easy, but seeing people like Mrs. Harper take responsibility gave her hope. The day ended quietly, with Alicia and Kayla sitting together on the couch, sharing stories about their days. Alicia told Kayla about Mrs. Harper's offer to help with the training sessions, and Kayla's eyes lit up. "Do you think she'll be nicer now?" Kayla asked. "I think she's trying," Alicia replied. "Sometimes it takes a mistake to realize how much you need to change." Kayla nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think I could help too? Like with the competition Ms. Taylor mentioned?" Alicia's eyebrows rose. "You want to write about what happened?" "Maybe," Kayla said, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "I think it could help people understand." Alicia smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I think that's a wonderful idea." The morning sun peeked through the curtains of the Bennett apartment, casting a warm glow over the living room where Kayla sat cross-legged on the floor. A notebook rested in her lap, and her pencil hovered just above the page. She had been staring at the blank lines for nearly 10 minutes, unsure how to begin. The idea of writing her story for the school storytelling competition both excited and scared her. What if no one wanted to hear what she had to say? What if they didn't understand? Alicia appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. "Still thinking about the competition?" she asked, setting one mug beside Kayla. Kayla nodded. "I want to do it, but I don't know if it's good enough." Alicia sat down beside her, placing an arm around her shoulder. "Your story is already good enough, because it's yours. Just start with how you felt. The words will come." Taking her mother's advice, Kayla began to write. She described the nervousness she felt when she first walked into Stanton Memorial alone, the way her chest tightened when Mrs. Harper dismissed her, and the heat of embarrassment as people stared. She wrote about how small and invisible she felt until she saw her mother. She paused, staring at the words. Her fingers gripped the pencil tighter as she thought about how much she had wanted to cry in that moment but didn't. She had stood her ground, even when no one believed her. Kayla looked up at Alicia, who was flipping through a hospital policy draft on the couch. "Do you ever feel invisible, Mom?" Alicia froze mid-page, caught off guard by the question. She set the draft aside and turned to her daughter. "I used to. A lot," she admitted. "When I first started working at the hospital, I felt like no one noticed me unless I made a mistake. But that's part of why I worked so hard, so I wouldn't feel that way anymore." "Does it ever stop?" Kayla asked. Alicia smiled gently. "Not completely, but what matters is how you see yourself. If you know your worth, other people will start to see it too." Kayla thought about that as she returned to her writing. For the first time, she felt a spark of confidence that her words mattered. The next day at school, Kayla shared her story draft with Ms. Taylor. The teacher read it carefully, her expression growing thoughtful as she turned each page. "This is powerful, Kayla," Ms. Taylor said when she finished. "It's honest and brave. You've captured something a lot of people feel but don't talk about." Kayla blushed. "You really think so?" "I do, and I think your classmates will feel the same way when you share it." Ms. Taylor's tone softened. "But remember, it's not just about what happened. It's about what you learned from it. What's your takeaway?" Kayla hesitated. I think I learned that people can change, and that even when it's hard, you have to stand up for yourself." Ms. Taylor nodded. "That's a message worth sharing." While Kayla was finding her voice at school, changes were already beginning to take root at Stanton Memorial. Alicia had finalized the hospital's new visitor policies, ensuring a more welcoming and inclusive environment. Training sessions for staff had started as well, with Dr. Carter and Ms. Clark leading the first few workshops. To Alicia's surprise, Mrs. Harper had been one of the most engaged participants. During one session, she even volunteered to share her perspective on what she had learned from the incident with Kayla. I realized that I was letting my own assumptions cloud how I treated people, Mrs. Harper admitted to the group. It wasn't fair to Kayla, and it wasn't fair to anyone. I'm working on being better, on really listening. The room had fallen quiet after her words, but Alicia noticed several heads nodding in agreement. It was a small moment, but an important one. As the week of the storytelling competition approached, Kayla grew more nervous. She practiced her speech in her room, pacing back and forth as she read aloud. She stumbled over a few sentences, then groaned in frustration. Alicia knocked softly on her door and peeked inside. "How's it going?" "I don't know," Kayla admitted, flopping onto her bed. "What if I mess up?" Alicia walked over and sat beside her. "Messing up is part of learning, Kayla. What matters is that you try." Kayla sat up, her brow furrowed. "What if no one listens?" "They'll listen," Alicia said, "because you have something important to say. And even if one person hears you and feels inspired, it'll be worth it." Kayla nodded, though her nerves still lingered. When the day of the competition finally arrived, Kayla felt like her heart was beating out of her chest. She stood backstage at the school auditorium, clutching her note cards tightly. She peeked out from behind the curtain and saw Alicia sitting in the audience, smiling up at her. "Next up, we have Kayla Bennett," the announcer called. Kayla took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight felt blinding at first, but as she began to speak, the room seemed to shrink. She talked about the hospital lobby, the hurt of being ignored, and the strength it took to keep speaking up. "And I learned," she said, her voice steady now, "that standing up for yourself doesn't mean being loud or angry. It means believing in your own worth, even when no one else does. And sometimes that belief can change everything." The audience was silent for a moment, and then applause erupted. Kayla spotted Alicia in the front row, clapping the loudest of all. After the competition, students and parents approached Kayla to tell her how much her story had resonated with them. One girl, shy and soft-spoken, told Kayla, "That happened to me once too, but I didn't know how to say it. You're really brave." Kayla beamed, realizing her words had reached further than she expected. Later that evening, as Alicia and Kayla walked home, they reflected on how far they had come since that day in the hospital lobby. "Mom," Kayla said, looking up at her, "do you think people are really changing at the hospital?" "I do," Alicia said, smiling, "and it's because of you. You reminded all of us that kindness matters." The next morning, Kayla woke up feeling a little different. She couldn't explain it at first, but as she stretched and got out of bed, the events of the storytelling competition came rushing back. For the first time in a long while, she felt proud not just for standing up and sharing her story, but for knowing it had resonated with others. Alicia noticed the change too. Over breakfast, Kayla's chatter about school was livelier than usual. She recounted moments from the competition, her excitement bubbling over. "And then this girl from my class, Lila, she said my story reminded her of something that happened to her family," Kayla said between bites of cereal. "She said it made her feel like she wasn't alone." Alicia smiled, setting her coffee mug down. "That's the power of speaking up. You never know who you might be helping." Kayla beamed. "It felt good, Mom. Like, really good." That afternoon, Kayla brought her newfound confidence to school. For the first time, she volunteered to read aloud in class. She raised her hand to answer questions, even when she wasn't entirely sure of the answers. Her classmates noticed the shift, and a few even commented on it during lunch. "You're braver than me," Lila said, sliding her tray next to Kayla's. "I'd never be able to get up in front of all those people." "It wasn't easy," Kayla admitted. "I was so nervous, I thought I might faint. But once I started talking, it got better." "Maybe I'll try next year," Lila said with a small smile. "If you can do it, maybe I can too." Kayla grinned. "You definitely can." While Kayla was thriving at school, Alicia was focused on implementing the hospital's new policies. The ripple effects of her efforts were beginning to show. Dr. Carter had taken the lead on the staff training sessions, and participation had been higher than expected. Even the more skeptical department heads had started coming around. One afternoon during a training session, Mrs. Harper stood up to share her reflections. The room fell silent as she spoke. "I'll admit," Mrs. Harper began, wringing her hands nervously, "when I first heard about these changes, I didn't think they were necessary. I thought I was doing my job just fine. But after what happened with Kayla, I realized I wasn't treating people the way they deserve to be treated. And that's on me." Dr. Carter nodded encouragingly. "Acknowledging that is an important first step, Mrs. Harper." Mrs. Harper continued, her voice steadier now. "I want to do better, not just for the patients and visitors, but for myself too." Her words struck a chord with the room. Alicia, who had been observing from the back, felt a flicker of pride. This was what she had been fighting for, a culture of accountability and growth. That evening, Alicia shared the news about Mrs. Harper's progress with Kayla. "She's really trying," Alicia said, as they sat together on the couch. "And it's because of you." Kayla tilted her head. "Because of me?" "You were the one who stood up to her," Alicia explained. "You reminded her and all of us that we can do better." Kayla thought about that for a moment. "Do you think I could help with the training sessions?" Alicia raised an eyebrow. "You want to help train the staff?" "Not like a teacher," Kayla clarified. "But maybe I could share my story, like I did at the competition." Alicia smiled, impressed by her daughter's determination. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Let's talk to Dr. Carter about it." The next week, Kayla joined Alicia at the hospital for a staff training session. Dr. Carter had agreed to let her speak during the final portion of the workshop. As they walked into the conference room, Kayla felt a familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach. "You'll do great," Alicia whispered, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. The room was filled with hospital staff nurses, receptionists, security guards, and even a few doctors. Kayla took a deep breath as Dr. Carter introduced her. "Today we have a special guest," Dr. Carter said with a warm smile. "Kayla Bennett has graciously agreed to share her experience with us. Please give her your attention." Kayla stepped to the front of the room, clutching her note cards tightly. The faces in the audience blurred slightly as she began to speak, but with each word, her confidence grew. She recounted her experience in the lobby, the way she had felt dismissed and invisible. But she also spoke about the kindness she had encountered, the old woman who gave her a tissue, Lydia's hot chocolate, and most importantly, her mother's unwavering support. "And I learned something important," Kayla said, her voice steady. "Even when it feels like no one is listening, you have to keep believing in yourself. Because when you do, you can inspire others to believe too." The room erupted in applause as Kayla finished, and she spotted tears in a few people's eyes. Alicia, seated in the front row, looked prouder than ever. After the session, staff members approached Kayla to thank her for sharing her story. One nurse admitted, "I didn't realize how much small actions could hurt or help. Thank you for reminding me." Mrs. Harper also came forward, her expression soft. "Kayla, I know I've said it before, but I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. Hearing your story today, it makes me even more determined to do better." Kayla smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. "Thank you for saying that. I believe you." In the weeks that followed, the changes at Stanton Memorial continued to take shape. Alicia's leadership inspired other department heads to reevaluate their practices, leading to broader discussions about inclusivity and respect. For Kayla, the experience of sharing her story had ignited a passion for helping others find their voice. She started writing more, keeping a journal of her thoughts and ideas for future speeches. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, she turned to Alicia and said, "Do you think I could be like you one day? You know, helping people and making things better?" Alicia smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I think you already are." The weeks that followed Kayla's speech at the hospital training session were filled with subtle but meaningful changes. At Stanton Memorial, staff began sharing stories about their own moments of growth, spurred by the training sessions. Nurses spoke about listening more carefully to patients. Security guards shared their renewed focus on empathy, and even Mrs. Harper seemed lighter. Her approach at the reception desk warmer than it had ever been. For Kayla, the experience of sharing her story had unlocked something new. She no longer felt invisible. At school, she started raising her hand in class more often, even volunteering for leadership roles she had once shied away from. The confidence she'd built was spilling over into every part of her life, but with it came a sense of responsibility. One day after school, Kayla found herself sitting in Ms. Taylor's classroom. The teacher was going over submissions for the district's annual Youth Leadership Conference, where students were invited to give talks on issues they cared about. "I think you should apply, Kayla," Ms. Taylor said, sliding a flyer across the desk. "You already have a great story. This could be your chance to share it with an even bigger audience." Kayla picked up the flyer, scanning the bold letters at the top. "Empower Voices, Youth Leadership in Action." Her heart fluttered with both excitement and doubt. "But what if they don't pick me?" Ms. Taylor smiled warmly. "They'd be lucky to have you. Besides, it's not just about being chosen. It's about putting yourself out there." Kayla nodded slowly. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but the idea of reaching more people with her story tugged at her. That evening, Kayla sat at the kitchen table with the flyer in front of her. Alicia, tired but content after another long day at the hospital, joined her with a cup of tea. "What's that?" Alicia asked, nodding at the paper. Kayla hesitated before sliding it over. "Ms. Taylor thinks I should apply for this conference. I'd have to give a speech." Alicia scanned the flyer, her eyes lighting up. "Kayla, this is amazing. You'd be perfect for this." "But what if I mess up?" Kayla asked, her voice wavering. "It's so much bigger than the competition. What if I'm not ready?" Alicia set her tea down and leaned forward. "You'll never feel completely ready, sweetheart. But you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself." Kayla bit her lip, her nerves warring with her excitement. "Will you help me with it?" "Of course," Alicia said, smiling. "We'll work on it together." Over the next few days, Kayla and Alicia worked together on her application. They brainstormed ideas for her speech, focusing on the lessons Kayla had learned at the hospital and how standing up for herself had inspired change. "Remember to make it personal," Alicia advised one evening as they sat in the living room, papers spread across the coffee table. "People connect with stories that feel real." Kayla nodded, jotting down notes. "Do you think I should talk about Mrs. Harper? Or Lydia? They were part of the story, too." "I think that's a great idea," Alicia said. "It shows how even small acts, good or bad, can make a big difference." By the time Kayla submitted her application, she felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. All she could do now was wait. Meanwhile, Stanton Memorial continued to feel the effects of Alicia's leadership. One afternoon, Kayla joined her mother at the hospital to sit in on another training session. She wasn't scheduled to speak this time, but she enjoyed watching the staff learn and grow. After the session, Mrs. Harper approached Kayla. Her smile was genuine, and her usually sharp demeanor had softened. "Kayla, I wanted to thank you again for sharing your story with us. It's made me think a lot about how I treat people." Kayla smiled shyly. "Thank you for listening." Mrs. Harper hesitated, then added, "You're going to do great things. I can feel it." The comment stayed with Kayla as she left the hospital that day. Coming from Mrs. Harper, it felt like a full-circle moment, proof that change was possible, even in the most unexpected places. A week later, Kayla's phone buzzed during dinner. She picked it up and gasped, nearly spilling her water. "Mom, I got in!" she exclaimed, waving her phone excitedly. "They want me to speak at the conference." Alicia jumped up and hugged her, laughing. I knew they would. This is incredible, Kayla. Kayla beamed, her earlier doubts melting away. She felt a surge of pride, knowing her story had made an impact. As the conference approached, Kayla threw herself into preparation. Alicia helped her refine her speech, encouraging her to focus on the themes of perseverance and kindness. You've seen firsthand how one person can make a difference, Alicia reminded her during a late-night practice session. Share that with your audience. Let them see what you've learned. Kayla practiced in front of the mirror, in the living room, and even at school during lunch breaks. With each rehearsal, her confidence grew, though the nerves lingered. You're going to be amazing, Lila told her one day at school. I wish I could come watch. Me too, Kayla said with a grin. But I'll tell you all about it. The night before the conference, Kayla sat at the kitchen table with her note cards spread out in front of her. Alicia joined her, setting down a cup of tea. Are you ready? Alicia asked gently. Kayla looked at her mother, then down at the note cards. I think I am. Alicia reached across the table and squeezed her hand. No matter what happens tomorrow, remember that you've already made a difference, just by being you. Kayla nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She was nervous, but she was also excited. For the first time, she truly believed in herself. The morning of the Youth Leadership Conference arrived crisp and sunny, the kind of day that felt full of possibility. Kayla sat in the car beside Alicia, clutching her neatly written note cards in her lap. Her fingers fidgeted nervously, flipping the edges back and forth as the car rolled toward the community center where the event was being held. Remember to breathe, Alicia said gently, glancing at her daughter. You've practiced so many times. You know this speech inside and out. Kayla gave a tight-lipped smile. I know, but what if I forget everything when I get on stage? Then you take a deep breath, pause, and remember why you're there, Alicia said, her tone steady and encouraging. You're not there to be perfect, Kayla. You're there to be yourself. The words sank into Kayla's mind as they pulled into the parking lot. She spotted groups of students and parents milling around outside, chatting excitedly. Her nerves spiked, but she squared her shoulders and stepped out of the car. Inside the community center, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. A large stage dominated the front of the room, and rows of folding chairs filled the space. Kayla felt a mix of awe and intimidation as she surveyed the setup. A volunteer guided her and Alicia to the check-in table, where a cheerful woman handed Kayla a name badge. Welcome, Kayla. You'll be speaking fourth today. The MC will call your name when it's time. Fourth? Kayla echoed, her stomach twisting. That felt so soon. You'll be great, Alicia said, squeezing her hand. I'll be right here in the audience. Kayla nodded, her grip tightening on her note cards. She took a seat in the waiting area behind the stage, where the other speakers were gathered. Some were chatting quietly, while others sat silently, rehearsing under their breath. Kayla felt like her heart was trying to pound its way out of her chest. As she waited, a girl about her age with curly hair and a friendly smile sat down beside her. Hi, I'm Mia, the girl said. Are you nervous too? Kayla let out a shaky laugh. A little. Me too, Mia admitted. But my mom says nerves just mean you care about what you're doing. Kayla thought about that. I guess that's true. What's your speech about? Mia asked. Kayla hesitated, then said, It's about standing up for yourself and how little things like kindness can make a big difference. Mia's face lit up. That sounds amazing. I can't wait to hear it. Kayla smiled, her nerves easing slightly. What's yours about? Overcoming fear, Mia replied, which I guess I'm doing right now by being here. Kayla chuckled. Me too. When the MC finally called her name, Kayla's heart leapt into her throat. She stood, smoothing her dress nervously, and made her way to the stage. The bright lights were blinding at first, but as she approached the microphone, she spotted Alicia in the front row, smiling up at her. Kayla took a deep breath, just as her mother had told her to, and began. She spoke about her experience at Stanton Memorial, the fear and frustration of being dismissed, the small acts of kindness that had kept her going, and the courage it took to stand up for herself. Her voice trembled at first, but as she continued, it grew steadier, stronger. "And I learned," she said, her gaze sweeping the audience, "that kindness isn't just about what you say, it's about what you do. Sometimes, the smallest action can make the biggest difference, and standing up for yourself can inspire others to do the same." The room was silent for a moment as her words sank in, and then applause erupted. Kayla felt a rush of relief and pride as she stepped back from the microphone, her heart soaring. As Kayla returned to her seat, a few of the other speakers gave her encouraging smiles. Mia gave her a thumbs up, mouthing, "You nailed it." When the event concluded, the audience was invited to mingle with the speakers. Kayla was overwhelmed by the number of people who came to talk to her. "That was beautiful," one woman said. "My son has struggled with speaking up for himself. Your story is going to help him so much." A man in a suit shook her hand and said, "You're going to change the world, young lady." Kayla flushed under the praise, but felt a sense of validation she'd never experienced before. Her words had mattered. On the drive home, Kayla leaned back in her seat, her note cards resting on her lap. "That was amazing," she said, a wide grin spreading across her face. "I didn't think it would feel this good." "You were incredible," Alicia said, glancing at her daughter with pride. "I knew you would be." Kayla hesitated, then said, "Do you think I could do more things like this? Like, keep sharing my story?" "I think you can do anything you set your mind to," Alicia replied. "And if this is something you want to keep doing, I'll support you every step of the way." Kayla nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. For the first time, she felt like she had a purpose, a way to make a difference. Over the next few days, Kayla's phone buzzed constantly with messages from classmates, teachers, and even some people from the conference. Everyone seemed to have been touched by her story, and many encouraged her to keep sharing it. At Stanton Memorial, Alicia noticed a similar ripple effect. Staff members began taking more initiative in creating a welcoming environment. Mrs. Harper, in particular, had become a quiet leader among her peers, often reminding others to approach situations with empathy. One afternoon, as Alicia passed the reception desk, Mrs. Harper stopped her. "Dr. Bennett, I just wanted to thank you again for giving me a second chance. I see things so differently now, and it's all because of what Kayla showed me." Alicia smiled warmly. "You're the one who chose to change, Mrs. Harper. That's something to be proud of." The days following the Youth Leadership Conference were a whirlwind for Kayla. Messages of encouragement and gratitude poured in from classmates, teachers, and even strangers who had attended the event. Each note filled her with a growing sense of purpose. For the first time, she felt like her voice had not only been heard, but also made a difference. At Stanton Memorial, Alicia noticed the change in Kayla's demeanor. Her daughter carried herself differently now, shoulders back, chin up, her words confident and clear. Kayla was no longer the quiet girl afraid to raise her hand in class or speak her mind. She had found her voice, and Alicia couldn't have been prouder. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Kayla flipped through the messages she had received. "Mom," she began, looking up thoughtfully, "do you think I've really helped people?" Alicia set down her cup of tea and smiled. "I know you have. The way you've inspired others, it's incredible, Kayla. And it's just the beginning." Kayla nodded, her mind drifting back to the first time she had stepped into Stanton Memorial's lobby, alone. It felt like a lifetime ago. The fear, the frustration, the small acts of kindness that had carried her through, they were all pieces of a larger story, one that was still unfolding. "Do you remember Mrs. Harper?" Kayla asked suddenly. Alicia chuckled. "How could I forget?" "I think she's really changed," Kayla said. "The last time I saw her, she seemed so different." "She has changed," Alicia agreed. "And part of that is because you gave her a reason to reflect. Sometimes it takes someone brave enough to speak up to spark that kind of growth." That week, Stanton Memorial held its first Culture of Compassion Awards, an initiative Alicia had championed to recognize staff members who exemplified empathy and kindness. The award ceremony was a small, intimate gathering in the hospital's conference room, with light refreshments and heartfelt speeches. Kayla sat in the front row, invited as a special guest. When Alicia took the stage to present the awards, her voice was warm and steady. "Today, we're celebrating not just individuals, but a collective effort to create a better environment for our staff, our patients, and everyone who walks through our doors," Alicia began. "This is about progress, about recognizing that we're all capable of change." She presented awards to several staff members, including Lydia, the receptionist who had offered Kayla hot chocolate, and Dr. Carter, who had led the training sessions with such dedication. Finally, Alicia called Mrs. Harper to the stage. "Mrs. Harper has shown us what it means to grow," Alicia said. "She took a difficult moment and turned it into an opportunity to reflect and improve. Her journey reminds us all that it's never too late to choose kindness." The room erupted in applause as Mrs. Harper accepted her award, her face glowing with pride. Kayla clapped the loudest, feeling a surge of joy for the woman who had once dismissed her. As the ceremony ended, Dr. Carter approached Kayla with a warm smile. "Kayla, I've been meaning to ask, how would you feel about working with us on a new project? We want to create a video series for staff training, and I think your story would be a great addition." Kayla's eyes widened. "You want me to help?" "Absolutely," Dr. Carter said. "You have a way of connecting with people that's rare. I think your perspective could make a real difference." Kayla glanced at Alicia, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd love to," Kayla said, her heart racing with excitement. Over the next few weeks, Kayla worked with Dr. Carter and Alicia to develop the training series. She shared her story on camera, weaving in lessons about empathy, perseverance, and the power of small actions. The process was challenging at times, but Kayla found that the more she spoke, the more natural it felt. The videos were rolled out across Stanton Memorial and soon became a staple of staff orientation. Employees praised the series for its authenticity, and many said it made them think differently about their roles. One evening, after the videos had launched, Alicia and Kayla sat together in their living room, watching the final product. Seeing herself on screen felt surreal for Kayla, but it also filled her with pride. "You've done something amazing, Kayla," Alicia said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've helped create something that will keep making a difference for years to come." Kayla leaned against her mother's shoulder, a contented smile on her face. "I couldn't have done it without you." Months later, Stanton Memorial felt like a different place. The lobby, once a source of anxiety for Kayla, had transformed into a space filled with warmth and care. Staff members greeted visitors with genuine smiles, and the changes Alicia had implemented were evident in every interaction. One day, as Kayla and Alicia walked through the hospital together, Kayla paused near the reception desk. Mrs. Harper was chatting with a family, her tone gentle and kind. Kayla couldn't help but smile. "You okay?" Alicia asked. "Yeah," Kayla said, nodding. "I just realized this place feels different now, like it's somewhere I belong." Alicia squeezed her hand. "That's because you helped make it that way." Kayla beamed, her heart swelling with pride. She had found her voice, her strength, and her place, and she knew this was only the beginning. As Kayla and Alicia left Stanton Memorial that day, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the city. They walked hand in hand, both feeling lighter than they had in a long time. Their journey had been filled with challenges, but every step had brought them closer to each other, and to the change they wanted to see in the world. Kayla had found her voice, and Alicia had reignited her passion for leading with compassion. Together, they had shown that even small acts of courage and kindness could create ripples that touched countless lives. Their story was proof that anyone, no matter their age or circumstance, could inspire meaningful change. It wasn't just about being heard. It was about listening, growing, and believing in the power of connection. As they walked home, Kayla looked up at her mother and said, "I can't wait to see what comes next." Alicia smiled, her heart full. "Me too." Thank you for joining us on this journey with Kayla and Alicia. Their story reminds us that we all have the power to make a difference, whether through small acts of kindness, speaking up for what's right, or simply believing in ourselves. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories about courage, growth, and hope. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's continue to create a world where everyone feels they belong. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time.